I've been wanting to make this video on a topic that's been coming up with more regular frequency with my integration clients and also with some of my students. And I wanted to issue this video to help hopefully create some clarity around what I feel is the over-identification of, quote, trauma release in association with somatic experiences in correlation with use of 5-MeO DMT. So here's the problem. The problem is that there has become an over-identification, an over-determination that all somatic experiences and releases on 5-MeO DMT are related to trauma and the processing and releasing of trauma. And I think that this is a fundamentally incorrect opinion. And in fact, I would argue the opposite, that most somatic experiences and releases on 5-MeO DMT are actually not related to trauma. And with this cultural emphasis around being trauma informed and being therapeutically aware and the use of therapeutic terms and language, that there has become this overdetermination of association with certain kinds of somatic events that can occur in a psychedelic session, and particularly with 5-MeO DMT. Right? I'm focusing on 5-MeO because this is where I focus the most, and so this probably applies to other psychedelics as well, but we're just talking about 5-MeO DMT today. But that it's become overdetermined, where every release of emotion or every convulsion in the body or every vibration is being identified as that was trauma releasing. And let's just be clear, that's not really how any of this works. So just as an example, the other week I had a client who was on an integration call with me, and he was telling me about how wildly and rapidly his body was vibrating during his 5-MeO DMT experience. And after he shared that with me, he said, I'm not aware of any trauma that I've experienced, but I guess I was releasing trauma, so I must have been traumatized somewhere. So that's the problem. And I see the same thing with facilitators or people who are in training to be facilitated, where they are over-identifying, where they're saying, I had a client who had these convulsions that were happening, and then they were screaming and crying and they were vomiting or something like that, and say, that was a release of trauma. So I helped the client explore what the source of their trauma might be and how it was released. And again, I think that that's an overdetermination, that there the facilitator is providing an interpretation to the client and trying to identify, oh, these events happened in your body that I witnessed here in the event of consuming 5-MeO DMT, and I'm going to give you an interpretive story about your trauma and how you're releasing it. Now, with that said, an identification that I think that this is a problem. This is happening too much, and it's happening by people who are not really qualified to determine if something is, quote, trauma or not, because it's just become part of the common cultural parlance. It's part of our discourse today that everybody wants to talk about their trauma. They want to talk about their nervous system regulation. And these are important concepts. They are valid in psychedelic work and psychedelic therapy. At Mindscape Institute, where I teach the 5-MeO DMT Integration Training Specialist course, 5-MeO DMT Integration Specialist Training course, not the other way around. And I also teach in the Trauma-Informed 5-MeO DMT Facilitation course. We do talk about all of this, but we try to distinguish the reality that not all somatic events are about trauma. And there's a lot of stuff going on with 5-MeO DMT that I personally don't think has anything at all to do with trauma. And really a big part of the difficulty, or a big part of the problem, is this overarching need to create identification, to create meaning, and to create stories around what we could otherwise just call normal energetic events. That when you work with 5-MeO DMT, there's an excellent chance that there's going to be a lot of somatic stuff going on. And it doesn't need to be directly identified as, oh, it comes from this, it comes from that, this is your trauma, this is what it's going to do for your nervous system. That's just overdetermination. And really what I like to encourage is allowing this openness of not knowing and just staying present with the experience. And for a client, I like to emphasize that if it's important for you to know what that energetic process was about, you'll probably have some intuitive understanding of that. And in most cases, if there really is a direct cause, you'll know it. You won't have to wonder. You won't have to make stuff up. You won't have to dig back into your memory or start saying, well, maybe this was something that happened in utero, or maybe this was something that had happened in a past life, or maybe this was something that I picked up from somebody else and I'm processing, and now I want to identify what that is. That we really want to allow a lot of space and a lot of room for just allowing somatic experience and energetic processing. And again, if the client comes up with an interpretation, I think it can be the role of a facilitator to encourage them, or even an integration guide, to encourage that client to hold that story very lightly. Specifically, if there aren't corroborating facts and data coming from elsewhere. Because hopefully, as you know, as we should all know, it's entirely within the realm of possibility for people to generate false memories, memories of things that never happened. It's actually very, very easy to do. And even the generation of false memories and creating an identifying story can simply be the work of the ego trying to make sense and categorize its experience. But it might not be objectively true. It might not be confirmable. It might just be an open mystery of, well, maybe there was some abuse, maybe there was some traumatic experience. But if we can't corroborate it, we really want to hold that story very, very lightly, because a tendency of the ego, let's just be really blunt about it, the tendency of the ego is to be uncomfortable with uncertainty. So when faced with uncertainty, it is highly prone to make shit up and then go around behaving as though the stuff it just made up is true. It's a fundamental problem of the ego. This is one of the reasons why I like to say that really working with high dose, full release dose work with 5-MeO DMT is more of energetic shock therapy for the ego than it is trauma processing. Anyway, that's sort of my introduction. I was hoping to make this short, but maybe it's going to be a little bit long. But let's back up a minute and let's just define a few terms. So first of all, soma and somatic experience. You might not be familiar with this word. This actually comes from the ancient Greek. In Greek philosophy, psyche and soma were two things that were distinguished from each other by people like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and all these other dead guys from ancient Greece, toga-wearing folks. Psyche is the Greek word for the mind, or potentially also the spirit, but it's more clearly identified with the mind. And also psyche is rational. Psyche is logical. Psyche understands concepts, works with language, and is the intellect. And so that's, for example, that's where we get the word psychedelic, the idea that by ingesting some substance, that it is somehow manifesting your mind. And in many ways, I've also tried to identify that I think that there is a cognitive-centric bias in the psychedelic world, and it's evident in the word itself, psychedelic, this idea that you're gaining access to your mind, which when we overemphasize the mind, then we start to give preferential treatment to things like insights, breakthroughs, realizations, downloads, and we're talking about the mind. My biggest critique of that is that all of our insights, realizations, and breakthroughs, those are all products of the ego. Those are all part of the stories that we are telling ourselves and about our experience. And they all break down in the non-dual experience, which is what I'm most interested in, particularly with 5-MeO-DMT. But anyway, psyche was also identified by ancient Greek philosophers as being primarily masculine. And of course, as a philosopher, one who loves the goddess of wisdom, someone who is philosophia, which means Sophia is the goddess of wisdom, and philo means to love. So to love wisdom, if you're a philosopher, that means that you are cultivating your psyche, your logic, your rationality, your understanding, and, of course, your masculinity. Soma, on the other hand, is the ancient Greek word for the body, and it is associated with emotions and passions and sense of feeling and empathy, and you can probably guess it is identified as being feminine or female. And so, of course, we can see in ancient Greek philosophy, the primary emphasis is always on psyche. It's not on soma, it's on psyche, because you want to be a good, masculine, rational philosopher. Now, I'm not trying to diss philosophy. I think it's extremely valuable. I think the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and all the rest of them, they did a great job with what they had at the time. So, not trying to diss on them, but it sets up this dismissal of the body that has really ancient roots in Western culture and Western thought. So, soma was denigrated and psyche was elevated. So anyway, this is where we get the word somatic experience. So somatic experience refers to what is happening in the body. That is the soma. And also we can distinguish it for anybody who's a philologist. This has no connection to the Sanskrit word soma and the ancient Hindu god of Soma, which is the divine nectar of immortality, which was a psychedelic brew that was used in ancient times in India to help elevate consciousness. But there's a different relationship between mind and body in India versus ancient Greece. But anyway, we don't need to get into the Indian soma because it is the same word, it's spelled the same, S-O-M-A, but they're completely unrelated concepts, unrelated terms. And when we use the word somatic in contemporary English, it comes from the ancient Greek, not from ancient Sanskrit. Okay, so we can just leave that one aside for now. So as therapists have become more aware of trauma and how trauma is processed or repressed or lodged within the body and the nervous system, there has become something of a renewed interest in Western therapy, psychology, and psychoanalysis around what is the relationship between the embodied experience and what we might be experiencing on a mental or emotional level, and how that might relate to various traumatic experiences that we might have endured as human beings. And there's this new catchphrase that gets used a lot of the body keeps score. And somebody wrote a book about that. I forget the person's name, doesn't really matter. But the basic idea is that traumatic experiences fundamentally get lodged in the body somehow. And this is not some mystical, metaphysical thing. It's not like, yeah, there's a glob of trauma that's in my body over here and I've got to get it out. It's not what it is. It's more related to our nervous system. And this is an electrical system that functions all throughout the body. We have this beautiful fractal branch system of nerves and nerve endings that move throughout the body in these beautiful fractal branches, kind of like the veins of the leaf on a tree. And we send electrical signals, and those electrical signals say, be alert, relax. And ideally, we want a nervous system that has, like our heart rate, a lot of variability. It can go up, it can go down. It can become excited and alert. It can become charged with adrenaline, or it can move into a state of relaxation, a state of calm. And of course, as I'm sure you know, that these different states of our nervous system are intimately related to our mental state, our emotional state, our breathing patterns, and also how we are embodying and exhibiting energy within our bodies, meaning do we have a nervous shaking presentation like, oh, like my nerves are fried, or are we so relaxed that we're just completely checked out, or are we relaxed and present? It's something that we can see. We just observe people's behavior. It's nothing too mystical or complicated here. Now with trauma, when we either have a singular event or even a series of events that might extend over a long period of time, what therapists are looking at is how the nervous system becomes dysregulated because of traumatic experiences, and that then this dysregulation becomes patterned within the nervous system, so that we then might have a disproportionate response to a current event because it is triggering the trauma response from previous events or experiences that we may have had. So for example, a combat veteran who lived in a war zone and fought in a war zone and experienced lots of exploding bombs and lots of gun shooting is going to have a very difficult time transitioning back into ordinary society because their nervous system and their awareness has been bombarded by all of these disturbing events. And they haven't had a chance to fully process that through. And then, as a result, let's say a combat veteran who has not treated their PTSD, their post-traumatic stress disorder, they might be in a parking lot and a car backfires next to them. And rather than being able to calmly say, whoa, the car backfired, it triggers the trauma response of flight, fight, freeze, or fawn. So this is where the response has been embedded in the nervous system, where I've got to fight because that's a gunshot, or that's a bomb, or I've got to get away, or I'm just frozen, I don't know what to do, or I can fawn, I can try and smooth over the situation by disproportionately trying to be appeasing in my behaviors and in my actions. These are not voluntary, these are conditioned responses within the nervous system. And so the process of working with somebody who has trauma is about helping them re-regulate the nervous system. And that might involve letting go of repressed emotions, of changing the story that they're telling themselves, of encountering these aspects within themselves and giving them an opportunity to process and move out, and therefore re-regulate the nervous system so that somebody can, quote, feel normal rather than traumatized or depressed or anxious. And this is completely valid work. I think that it's very important. I'm not trying to diss on it in any way, but again, I think most of what happens in a 5-MeO DMT session just not related to what we're talking about here. So now here's the next element, and I think this is where a lot of people ultimately become confused. So there's kind of this story or this little analogy that's being spread around the world with the idea of, so there's an antelope, and the antelope is peacefully going across the field and munching on grass and doing super awesome antelope things. But there's a lion, and the lion says, "You look good, I'm hungry." So the lion attacks the antelope, and that's traumatic, right? I mean, I'm an antelope. I'm eating grass here, and you lion, you're chomping on my neck. So the lion jumps on the antelope and is slashing it with its claws, and it's biting it, and of course the antelope is afraid for its life. Like, I don't want to be a meal. This looks like death. But in the story, the antelope gets away and is not eaten by the lion. It was an unsuccessful attempt at hunting. And according to the information within this story, when the antelope has the opportunity to do so, it will then start to shake and convulse. And then when that's done, it will then peacefully go back to grazing on grass as though nothing ever happened. So the idea is that the trauma of that experience, rather than getting lodged into the antelope's nervous system, essentially gets shaken out, gets vibrated, convulsed out, and that allows the antelope to go back to a relatively normal existence and not be so traumatized by being attacked by the lion that all it can do is sit there and think, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, where's the next lion? Oh shit, oh shit. So it's functional. Now, it's a bit of a stretch, I think, just blanketly applying this to human beings and saying, oh, well, if we could just shake like animals, then we would release all of the trauma. I think that human beings are a lot more complex than an antelope. We have a much more sophisticated self-referential system that we call the ego and our self-identity. We have a much more complex mental system that, going back to that psyche thing, where we tend to conceptualize, and we have a great capacity to recall the past and project into the future and to project possible outcomes. And in other words, we have a lot more mechanisms to create feedback loops of anxiety, paralysis, fear, depression, and all couched within this self-referential system that is the ego, that for the most part is missing in the antelope. So I think it's really way too simplistic if we just want to say, hey, be like an antelope and just shake it off. For me, that's highly, highly questionable whether it actually works that way. But anyway, this is then the theory. This is the theory that then many clients and facilitators and integration guides are then applying to psychedelic experience. So here, when we come to 5-MeO-DMT, we are encountering a psychedelic molecule that its primary characteristic is the overwhelming sensation of energy. It's not just some passive experience of like, oh, I'm altering my mind. But when you really, really go for it with a full release dose of 5-MeO-DMT, if you're able to completely relax and completely surrender within that experience, every molecule and every atom of your being will experience the sensation of these very fine, super fast vibrations. Everything is vibrating. And also experientially, there can be that sensation of everything is opening up from this point here, the heart, and energetically expanding out into the infinite and into the eternal. That's a lot of energy, isn't it? That's a lot of energy. And there's so much energy that these limited patterns of ego identification, as they are experienced in the neural network of the brain, they are not able to maintain themselves. So those energetic patterns, they dissolve. And the ego goes away. This is where the non-dual experience arises. And within that, there are unbelievable, unfathomable amounts of energy and energies, because there could be different spectrums of energy, raging through your body and through your being during that time. If it's a blissful experience, it can turn into a full-bodied cosmic orgasm, where every cell feels like it's releasing in this orgasmic ecstasy, every fiber of your being. Yet, for someone who is filled with fear, that can feel like an overwhelmingly hellish experience. So it's not automatically blissful or pleasurable. And within that, there's such a wide range of ways that bodies might process and experience that energy that have absolutely nothing to do with trauma. So here, let's just take a completely outside example. Imagine a roller coaster. Maybe you've been on a roller coaster. Maybe you loved it. Maybe you hated it. But notice we can take two people, one person who loves roller coasters and one person who hates roller coasters, and to some degree, they might behave nearly identically on the roller coaster ride. So, for example, one person who loves the roller coaster might be wildly screaming, but they're screaming in ecstasy because they find that to be pleasurable. They receive enjoyment from that experience. Versus the person who doesn't like roller coasters, they could also be screaming, but they're screaming in terror and anxiety and fear because they don't like the experience. But it's kind of the same response. And it's an energetic response to the event of going up and down and twisting around and having this kind of experience taking place. And, if we were sending somebody on a roller coaster, we definitely wouldn't be concerned about, well, is it regulating your nervous system or not? We wouldn't try and be trauma informed about it that way, because we know that a roller coaster is a big, explosive, potentially fear-inducing event, and that if you can relax and let go within it, you might enjoy it. But if you don't, it really could be a difficult experience. But then for the person who's been terrified, they might develop a trauma response around going on a roller coaster, right? So see, it does play in. Well, 5-MeO is like that. It's like the ultimate roller coaster, or it's like a nuclear explosion, or it's like a rocket ship. It is an experience of massive influx of energy that we can expect that the body's going to respond in a variety of different ways. And again, I don't think that most of this has to do anything with trauma. So, with 5-MeO DMT, whether or not the ego is present, bodies might writhe, they might convulse, they might vibrate, vocalizations can occur, there can be glossolalia, speaking in tongues, there can be screaming, there can be yelling, there can be repeated phrases that are said that even might fluctuate through a wide variety of different energies, even the same phrase repeated over and over and over again. There can be toning, there can be various forms of animalistic types of noises that are made. If there is no ego resistance, spontaneous body movements will tend to show bilateral symmetry where the left and right sides mirror each other. If there's a lot of ego resistance or fighting with the experience, which again doesn't need to come from trauma, it can just come from, this is super intense and potentially really terrifying. There can be a lot of side-to-side movement. There can be curling up into a ball. There can be shaking and wild experiences and people's heads going back and forth like that. There's just so many different things that can happen. And what I like to emphasize that the role of the facilitator is to help the client with tools and guidance for how to ride through this smoothly and most effectively. And that here I do make distinctions between how energy is embodied and processed through the ego versus how it is embodied and processed without the ego in the non-dual state. I'm not going to get into that. Watch my video on symmetry if you want more on that information. But again, the role of the facilitator is not to try and identify like, oh, was this trauma releasing? Also, it's not really the role of the client to try and determine, was this trauma releasing? And it is certainly not the role of the integration guide to say, oh yeah, this was trauma releasing. I mean, you really have to let your clients take the lead on that. If they want to say it's trauma, then you can even ask them like, well, how do you know? Right? These are relevant questions because we don't want to encourage people to make up stories that may or may not be true and then adopt them as a new identity and as a new construct through which they're living through. Ideally, we want to be removing the constructs, removing the bullshit, removing the illusions, removing the projections so that people can live authentically with themselves and then embody and express their energy in a way that is direct, immediate, authentic, honest, and true. This is something of a side note, but Another aspect of this dynamic that I think is incredibly problematic, that I would never encourage for anyone, is the reliance between a client and either a facilitator or a integration guide to give some kind of intuitive reading or interpretation. So my go-to phrase for everyone is when they ask, "What was that?" My answer is, "It's just energy." Versus if a client says, "Hey, what was that?" and the facilitator says, "Well, I had a psychic intuition that this was trauma from a past life that you were releasing, or this was something that happened in utero. Perhaps the umbilical cord was around your throat or something like that," where there's this idea that people can receive downloads of information and that through some mysterious psychic or telepathic means that they're able to give a legitimate interpretive event or description of what took place. Again, my preference is everyone just say it's just energy, and it's not my job as a facilitator, as the integration guide, to tell you, the client, how you're supposed to interpret this. And this is very different from identifying, oh, that was ego resistance versus that was a full surrender and a release of repressed energy. That's just a direct reading of the experience without providing interpretation. And this comes when you have greater expertise in the somatic process that arises with 5-MeO DMT, where you can really clearly see and identify, oh, that's this kind of process versus it's this kind of process. But it's not giving interpretation. It's not providing meaning. And certainly it's not telling people that they're releasing trauma. Now, questions of like nervous system regulation, that can come before a session with 5-MeO. That can also come after a session with 5-MeO. But it's not really about in the session with 5-MeO because, again, there's a massive amount of energy. The ego doesn't know how to control it, doesn't know what to do with it, and the body's going to process it in different ways. And I always like to remind people that the energy of 5-MeO DMT is so total, so overwhelming, and so complete that it can interact with anything within your system where there's a lack of expression, where there is repression, where there is judgment, where there is perhaps self-loathing, self-hatred, where there is an inappropriate story that you've been telling yourself about yourself, right? If you're identifying as this, that, or the other thing, but you're not really this, that, or the other thing. So it has this capacity to get into our entire system and find, hey, there's something to release here, or hey, you've been repressing this, or hey, you've really been holding on to this story, you've been holding on to this identification. And also there can be, there's that time that you felt shut down when you were a kid and your parents didn't respect you or something like that. So yes, it has the capacity to, anywhere within our life history and any experience we've ever had that has made an impact on us, it has the capacity to interact with that. But not every experience is trauma. And I think that we do need to be more clinical in our use of language of trauma, triggers, that just because you've had a difficult or challenging experience doesn't mean that that fits the technical category of being trauma. Doesn't mean that you were traumatized. Maybe it meant you had a difficult time. Maybe it meant you had a difficult experience. But again, I think that the language has become so pervasive in culture that it's being overutilized and it's over-determining people's interpretations of their experiences. This is why it is best to work with facilitators who are not over-determining trauma, who are not trying to interpret or provide meaning for people's experience other than the basic and objective energetic reading of the event. And the same goes for integration guides and specialists. It's all the much more problematic when people start introducing spiritual concepts and terms and metaphysics and ideology and doctrine. So I always encourage people to keep it as neutral and as objective as possible. But the basic upshot of all of this, again, I'm just going to repeat it, is that in my professional opinion, the vast majority of somatic experiences, experiences that are happening in the body in 5-MeO-DMT sessions, is not the release of trauma and is not trauma related. So please, everyone, stop over determining this use of the word trauma and you're releasing trauma. Most of it isn't. Most of it is just the body responding to an overwhelming energetic experience that it doesn't know how to handle. And there's lots of spontaneous stuff that arises. A great deal of it happens without the ego being present or the person even knowing that they're doing it. And it is not the job of the facilitator or the integration guide to tell someone that they have trauma and that they're releasing it. Hope this helps clarify things for you. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to take my 5-MeO-DMT Integration Specialist training course with Mindscape Institute. More than happy to teach you more about this very subject. All right, thanks for watching. There's a lot of videos here on my YouTube channel helping to educate and empower you for working with 5-MeO-DMT. This is just the latest. Please feel free to go through the 5-MeO-DMT, the God Molecule playlist here on the Entheogenic Evolution page. You'll find a lot more on this topic and others related to 5-MeO-DMT. Thanks for watching.